Ready.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Kurt Menke, and the title of my webinar is Thinking About QGIS as both a consultant and educator, because I wear both of those hats. So I'm going to start out introducing myself, a little about both arenas that I work in, and then I'm going to walk through some aspects of QGIS that I find especially intriguing and useful. And I'm going to give you some examples of some of the work I do both as a consultant and as an educator, and kind of just some of the thoughts I have about teaching open source GIS and QGIS specifically. Let me see. There we go. So my business is Bird's Eye View GIS, and I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The URL for my website is birdseyeviewgis.com. So if you're not familiar, this is where New Mexico is located within the U.S. It's high desert. It's a really ethnically diverse area with a lot of Native Americans and Hispanic populations. So it's an interesting place to live and work out of. So as an educator, I've been teaching FOSS4G since 2008. It was then that I started working with Phil Davis, and he helped me design my first class, which is an introduction to open source GIS. And I can see from the attendees that at least one of my past students is listening now, so that's kind of fun. This is a full semester class that I teach every summer at Central New Mexico Community College. I also teach some short courses at the University of New Mexico's Division of Continuing Education. I teach some regular Esri-based GIS classes, which are actually getting less fun to teach since I'm such an open source advocate. On the open source, I'm teaching a beginning QGIS class and an intermediate QGIS class, and have an advanced QGIS class in the development phases right now. So those are short 12-hour courses. And then I also teach a lot of professional workshops for organizations and agencies who are looking to expand their mostly QGIS skill sets, and I teach workshops at conferences as well. So I don't know if people have heard of the Geo Academy curriculum. This was a curriculum that I co-wrote with Rick Smith and John Van Hosen under the leadership of Phil Davis. And our basic idea was that we noticed that there were just a paucity of educational materials at the secondary level using open source GIS technologies. 99% of the colleges and universities are still, at least at the time, we're teaching an Esri-based curriculum. So our idea was, if we build it, they will come. If there was an openly licensed FOSS4G curriculum that educators could adapt to their own programs, then hopefully people would start using open source in the classroom more, because we recognize how much work it is to develop curriculum, and a lot of educators just don't have the time to do that. But if there's something they can use, then they were more likely to use it. It turned into a great curriculum. It's based on the geospatial competency model, the Department of Labor's standard for the skills, knowledges, and abilities that GIS professionals need in the marketplace today, and that was vetted amongst many professors nationwide. And we got some notoriety from that. Our team won the Geo for All Educator of the Year award in 2015 as part of that curriculum development. And that also led to some opportunities. Me and my co-authors for the Geo Academy were approached by PAC Publishing to write a book called Mastering QGIS, which we first published in 2015. And then I also updated the Geo Academy curriculum and published that through Locate Press as a workbook called Discover QGIS. And I know that Discover QGIS is now being used in classrooms around the world. And it's now, one of the challenges of being a QGIS author is that the software evolves so rapidly that books have a pretty short shelf life. So Discover QGIS, I'm in the planning phases of updating that now. Hopefully we'll have that out for version 3.2 or 3.4 but it's a kind of a daunting task. There's 750 screenshots that need to be updated to update that textbook. So as an educator, continued, I'm also a Geo for All lab. So I'm not a traditional lab because I'm not full-time employed by a college or a university, but I do create quite a bit of educational materials that are then usually licensed in an open way so people can use them. I'm also a QGIS certified trainer, and I'm going to talk about QGIS certification here in a minute because it's a very new program that people may not be aware of. And upcoming, I'm just wrapping up a course series at Continuing Ed this spring. In May, I'll be going to the Free and Open Source for Geospatial North America Conference in St. Louis, and there I'll be teaching a workshop called Data Visualization and Cartography in QGIS. So it's a really fun workshop, and I'll be teaching another version of that workshop at the Society for Conservation GIS. And that's kind of an interesting venue because that's been historically an Esri funded and Esri based organization. So to have some inroads there to show people QGIS and to see that there's interest in that is interesting to me. So QGIS certification, this is a new program that I've been working with the project steering committee and Tim Sutton, the recently departed chair of QGIS, on for the last couple years. And I was in Denmark at the QGIS Hackfest in last August, and Tim at that point with his company Cartosa had set up a system that has now evolved for managing QGIS certifications. And basically this is a way for educators to be able to offer a QGIS certificate on top of whatever else they may be offering for courses they teach that involve QGIS. There's an online system, and it hasn't been widely distributed as of yet because it's still kind of in the formative phases. The URL there will get you to the About page about QGIS certification currently. And essentially, educators can go there and create an organization, and there's an approval process so we want QGIS certification to mean something. So we've come up with a way to vet materials that people will be using in a QGIS certification setting. So we basically, several of us volunteers will vet the curriculum to make sure that QGIS is represented accurately and that the materials are up to date and things like that, and look valid. And at that point, you become an authorized QGIS certifier. You can go ahead and create your training centers and courses and things like that. So the certification, since it's international, we had to kind of arrive at a nice starting place, which means that currently, if you're teaching a course, what goes on the certificate is the number of contact hours and the title of the course. And it's up to you how you determine if someone has passed that class and earns the certificate or not. And what's nice about that is this system makes it possible for people to be certified anywhere from an 8-hour professional workshop all the way up to a full term, full semester course. And every certificate comes with a $20 donation back to the QGIS project. So that €20 donation has to be built into the fee structure of the workshop or the course that's being taught. And so this becomes another small revenue generating mechanism for the QGIS project. So as a consultant, I've been doing GIS for over 20 years at this point. I was an early adopter of free and open source for geospatial software. I was at the University of New Mexico in the early 2000s at a place called the Earth Data Analysis Center. And we started using then map server, GRASS, and PostGIS for building web apps. And that was at the very, pretty early on, 2001, 2002. And I really, a light bulb went off for me, and I started following open source softwares pretty closely from that point on. I first started using QGIS, well, I first downloaded it in 2005 or so, And at the time, it was, not a terribly powerful piece of software, but it was interesting, and I've tracked it ever since. These days, with my clients, I use QGIS and PostGIS and R and a lot of other open source softwares for all my new projects. And for my focus areas, I work mainly on environmental conservation projects. I work with a lot of nonprofit conservation organizations in the US, and I also do a lot of public health related GIS work. I also do quite a bit of volunteer service with the various GIS communities that I'm part of. I've recently helped revive the QGIS US user group. So there's now a website and a Twitter page for QGIS US, and we are now one of every QGIS national group becomes a voting member for the QGIS organization. So I'm also now, I've been designated as the voting member for the QGIS US group. So when issues come up, like voting for the QGIS project steering committee, I'm the one that represents the US in those votes. I'm involved with the QGIS certification program. I've been helping vet and approve new certifying organizations for that program. I occasionally will sponsor new QGIS features and plugins. I'm not a C++ developer myself, but I do sponsor QGIS and other features as I need to and can. I'm an OSGeo charter member since 2015, and I'm also involved in my local GIS community through the New Mexico Geographic Information Council. So in terms of services that I provide, it's pretty broad at this point. I do everything from cartography and spatial analysis through online mapping. And I wanted to spend quite a bit of time talking about why I use QGIS specifically. It's become a really powerful piece of software at this point. I would say ever since it hit version 2.0, which I must have been in 2012, 2013 or so, I think it's become a really robust, powerful piece of software. I think it has better interoperability than the proprietary options that are out there. I think a lot of tasks are just easier in QGIS, kind of requiring fewer clicks. It's developing really rapidly, and every 4 months a new version comes out, and it always comes with an exciting set of new features to use. And I think a lot of the development in recent years has started to change some of the ways that you can work with spatial data in some really exciting ways. One of the things that used to challenge QGIS, if you go back 6 or 7 years ago, was that it was great for spatial analysis, but wasn't so powerful at making really nice maps. And I think that is now flipped, where one of its real strengths is the cartographic tools that come with it. It's really fast. It's 64-bit, and I find that in terms of crunching big data sets, it's really efficient. And one of the things I personally enjoy is just working with the QGIS community. I find it to be a really helpful, friendly group of people who are always willing to help. And that's where the help comes from, so it's really nice. So I'm going to go through some slides now that cover some of the features that I really find useful in QGIS, and I'll have some animated GIFs in here so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about a little bit. So I think a lot of things, like I mentioned, are just easier in QGIS. So for example, reprojecting layers. In QGIS, you can simply right-click on a layer, and you get the Save Vector Layer As dialog you're seeing here. And at that point, you can choose from the huge array of vector file formats to save the layer into, and you can reproject it at the same time, save only the selected features. So you get all these options, whereas if I was to do this in ArcMap, I have to go into Arc Toolbox, open up the Project tool, and if I want to save it to a different format, that may have to be done in a separate operation. So just things are easier in QGIS. One of the first ways I started using it was just because QGIS can read a huge number of file formats. And so I started using it initially just if someone gave me a GPX or a KML file in QGIS, I don't have to import it. I can just drag and drop it into QGIS and save it out as some other format that I want to work with. And editing, I don't really spend a lot of time in this presentation going through editing, but QGIS has some very intuitive editing tools that are easy to work with. Interoperability. So this is, I think, one of the huge strengths of QGIS, and it's because QGIS, like a lot of open source softwares, is built on a stack of different supporting open source projects. So of course, QGIS leverages Google and Ogre to read and write vector and raster formats. And because of those libraries, QGIS can just read almost every vector and raster format that you're ever going to run into. And that makes it incredibly powerful. So it makes it so that any work you do in QGIS can be handed off to someone working in an Esri ecosystem, and they can bring in the data seamlessly, and vice versa. The geoprocessing capabilities of QGIS have long been a strength. The processing toolbox with its being able to leverage other geoprocessing tool providers like GRASS tools, Saga, Run R scripts, TauDM. There's a lot of power there. And so, you know, the toolbox is a pretty rich environment for geoprocessing tasks. I think one of the features that a lot of people new to QGIS don't realize is there is that it has a graphical modeler. And so if you've used the modeler in ArcGIS, this is, you know, analogous to that, where you can basically write a custom workflow visually, and you're creating a custom tool by doing that you can run on a variety of different softwares. It's a really powerful modeling environment. You can also run any of those tools in batch mode to process large quantities of data at one chunk. And then there's the Python console. So the PyQGIS API is really rich and gives you a lot of functionality. So it's both something you can use to customize QGIS and create nice geoprocessing workflows from the console. You can also use it to author your own Python plugins. So one of the kind of interesting features that's been around for a while now, but sometimes gets overlooked, is these things called variables in QGIS. And so these allow you to store any kind of constant number or string as a variable in QGIS, and you can store those at different tiers. You can have global variables, project level variables, or layer level variables. So I use these a lot to store, for example, conversion factors from square feet to square meters, or square meters to square miles or acres. You can also use this to store your name as cartographer. So on this slide, you're seeing the global variables, the project level variables, and the layer level variables. Some of these will be by default. Others you can add, like these unit conversions that I've added as global variables. So whenever I open up QGIS, I can quickly get at the conversion factors I need. So an example of these in action is I have to, seems like constantly, calculate acreage of polygons for a lot of the conservation projects I'm working on. So this makes it very easy. This is also an example of how some things are just easy in QGIS. This animated GIF is showing working with an attribute table in QGIS and calculating the acreage column. So as this reboots here, one of the nice things about QGIS is that once you put the table into edit mode, you get a little widget here that lets you pick the column that you want to calculate, open up the expression builder, and you can then put in your expression. And here I'm using the dollar area expression and multiplying that times my conversion factor that I have stored as a variable, square meters to acres. And boom, I can put that expression in and update the whole acreage column very quickly and easily. Another example of variables is using them in the print composer. So you can put in your name as cartographer, shown number 1 here, and you can then, when you are in the print composer, use that variable in text. So when you're going to assign yourself credit as cartographer, you can refer to your cartographer variable to auto-populate that. You can do the same thing with some of the default variables that come into play are project path name or project name. So if you want to actually put the QGIS document map name in the print composer, you can insert that as a variable. Very handy. So a pretty big area for me that I find really impressive and exciting about QGIS these days is the whole range of cartographic data visualization options that it contains. And I think, first and foremost, this color selector that QGIS comes with is one of the most robust color selectors I've seen anywhere. Here you're seeing there's 4 tabs for choosing colors, the standard color wheel, palettes of colors, and then finally with the eyedropper, a color picker that lets you choose colors from within QGIS, but really anywhere on your desktop. So sometimes I'll have a style guide that I need to follow, and that's in a PDF, and so I can pick a color directly from the PDF really easily. Another nice thing is that it honors hexadecimal colors. So sometimes I want to have a specific color and I only have the hexadecimal value for it, and I can simply plug that hexadecimal value in here to get that color along with hue, saturation, and value, and red, green, and blue. This next little animated GIF that pops up shows the layers panel in QGIS, and this little pop-up color widget is also available right in the table of contents that quickly allows you to access this color wheel or recent colors to quickly change things. And I think it's a really quick and easy, handy place to put that. As a longtime ArcMap user, I get kind of sick in ArcMap of having, and if anyone's used it, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, where you're trying to work on a kind of a complicated symbology for a layer, and you end up 3 levels deep into the symbology dialog and then having to click OK, 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 OK to pull yourself back out to see the result. Whereas here, you're just right-clicking and accessing some functionality right there. Another really cool feature that came out just last year, courtesy of Nathan Woodrow, one of the Australian developers, is this thing called the Interactive Styling Dock. And if you see the little paintbrush in the upper left corner of the layers panel, that's how you access it. And it opens a panel on the right-hand side. And this allows you to change or access all of the layer styling features that QGIS has to offer, but any changes you make are live. So you can simply go and change a color ramp here for total population and see the result immediately without having to click OK or actually, get into any other layer property dialog boxes. And it can be really powerful when you combine this with that color wheel, so you can slide that color wheel around and see the result on the map live and really fine tune and get the perfect color. And I like this. Niall Dawson, who's one of the most prolific developers of QGIS, said, "I've said it once and I'll say it again. Madman Wu's QGIS Style Dock is the single greatest advance in cartography since Mercator's discovery of the North Arrow in 1972. Kind of continuing on the cartography bent here, QGIS has the standard renderers that you get in a lot of GIS packages. single symbol, categorized and graduated. But it comes with a whole suite of additional renderers that are kind of unique to QGIS, such as the inverted polygons, 2.5D renderer for points, point displacement, point cluster, heat map, hill shade renderer for DEMs on the raster side. And then below that, there are geometry generator sub-renderers, shape burst fill. And so these allow you to do some really creative things. For example, if you combine inverted polygons with shape burst fill, you're able to create this thing called an inverted polygon shape burst fill, and you can use that to, I wish I had put an example of that in here. You can go to my blog and I have examples of it. But you can use this to create a coastal vignette for water, because you could use the land as the water layer, but use the inverted polygon renderer against the land. And when the inverted renderer basically flips the geometry and makes the geometry the opposite of what it was. So all of a sudden the land is equal to water, and then you can use the shape burst fill to go from dark blue to light blue and create that coastal vignette. Very quick and easy and very powerful. So some other styling features here are the blending modes that QGIS comes with. So these are standard modes that come with a lot of graphic packages like Adobe Illustrator. And here I'm showing you a land ownership layer on top of a shaded relief. And that's kind of one of the things that people will want to use. And historically, you would just create the semi-transparency. So here I'm using a transparency slider on land ownership so that you can see the shaded relief underneath it. But a more powerful way is instead to use the multiply blending mode in this case, which allows you to get the full saturation of all the land ownership colors and all the detail in the shaded relief simultaneously. And this creates a much nicer effect. And this is just one of 13 blending modes. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with those. So to take it a step further, this is from my data visualization workshop. This is Denmark. These are all the roads in Denmark. So previously what I was showing you was the use of layer blending. So applying a blending mode to an entire layer. In this example, what's being done is applying a feature blending mode. So this is a blending mode against the individual features in a layer. So in this example, I'm changing the feature blending mode to addition, and this creates a data visualization that kind of highlights the road density of the roads. And it's just a quick way of showing that can be really powerful, kind of with a geo-hipstery, modern cartography bent. And this is also another example of using that layer styling dock to just quickly make a change to the way the layer is styled and instantly seeing the result on the map. Another unique cartographic tool set that QGIS comes with are live layer effects. These allow you to add things like inner shadows, inner and outer glows, drop shadows to your vector features. So here I'm looking at a bunch of city points, and I'm turning on an outer glow and then opening up the live layer effects and then changing that to a drop shadow, just so you can see some of those effects. And for all of those, you can tinker with what color drop shadow, how the magnitude of the shadow and things like that. So in the category of both symbology and things are just easier here, copying and pasting styles. So in QGIS, you can right-click on a layer, from the context menu, choose Style, Copy Style, go to another layer and just paste that style. And this can be done between map documents too. And it doesn't just copy the styling for the polygons in this case, it also copies the labeling as part of that. So the whole layer style gets copied and pasted. And of course, you have to have the same underlying attribute data in this case. But again, incredibly quick and easy. So switching gears out of symbology into expressions and functions. So QGIS, another real strength I feel is the expression engine. It's something that's been exposed throughout the QGIS interface, even beyond knowing what the use case might be. And creative people like Anita Grazer and others are always finding interesting use cases for expressions in QGIS. The expressions are also a huge array of them, which with the recent release of QGIS 3 has even grown beyond what this slide shows. So there's some interesting expression categories like color expressions and functions, date and time, geometry, fuzzy matching. So there's a lot in here, and this is where you get at any variables also that you have stored in QGIS. And like I said, these are available everywhere. So you can use these to query attribute tables. You can also use it to write labeling expressions that involve multiple columns, rule-based styling. You can use them in the print composer, in the atlas generator. So there's a lot of power in these expressions. And I'll give you some examples of things that combine expressions with symbology here. So one of the sub-renderers that I had mentioned were these geometry generator symbol layers. And this is, to me, one of the really exciting areas of QGIS where it's kind of pushing the bounds of how we would have historically dealt with feature geometries. So these allow you to basically use spatial SQL against any layer, whether it's in a spatial database or not. So you can use it against shape files, for example. And the resulting geometry doesn't have to match the original source geometry. So I'll give you some examples of this. So here is a map of game management units for the state of Colorado. And if I want to play with geometry generators, I've chosen a single symbol renderer, but then for the sub-renderer, chosen geometry generator. Below that, you can choose what kind of geometry you want to convert this to. Here I've chosen point, multi-point, and I've just entered the expression centroid against the geometry. And so what that does is generate the centroids for each polygon. And this is just generating it in the way the data is being rendered. So here is live doing that. I'm duplicating the big game management boundaries. And then I'm going to go into the layer properties for that layer, choose simple fill, choose geometry generator, choose point, multi-point. Sorry, the phone went off. And then enter the expression. So I'm using centroid as the function, and the value is the geometry of the layer. And that will instantly create centroids for this layer in the way it's being rendered. Something that's similar to that are these things called virtual layers. That again is something that's come out in the last couple of years. And this allows you to define a layer based on spatial SQL. So it's kind of like a spatial SQL database view. And again, the data file format doesn't matter. You can create virtual layers from lots of different sources, any source that QGIS can read and write. So for example, here I have a table that has mountain lion XY coordinates for mountain lion sightings. And so I'm going into the virtual layer. I'm going to add that CSV as the layer. And then I'm going to enter this expression, which basically is creating points from the X and Y coordinates. So I'm instantly on the fly creating a point rendering of that CSV layer as points based on those two columns. And the powerful thing about doing it this way is that if I then go and if that CSV is something that gets updated or edited, as soon as a new point gets added to it, that new point will then show up in the view in QGIS since it's based on the live data. So it is that's one of the interesting things you can do with virtual layers. It's kind of a simple example. You can do other things, but again, it's kind of one of these ways that QGIS is kind of pushing the limits of how we would have dealt with geometries historically. There's also just a fantastic plugin ecosystem. So one of the really powerful plugins is Time Manager, developed by Anita Grosser. So this, in this example, you're looking at cyclone formation points, and I've used the Time Manager panel at the bottom of the window to set up how I want these points animated. So I'm animating them by year, and it's cycling through all 75 years of cyclone formation points that you're seeing, and in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the year, and it'll just play through until it's done through all 75 years. So you can use Time Manager for a lot of things. So there's a lot of very powerful plugins with QGIS, and this one just was updated for QGIS 3, which is nice. Another really nice plugin that also was just updated for 3 is this one called QGIS to 3GIS, and this is a plugin that lets you set up a 3D view in QGIS and publish that on the web as a web page. So on the upper left here, you're seeing Mount Rainier rendered as a 3D scene, and I'm really impressed with how responsive the web viewer is and how intuitive it is to navigate around the scene. So that's a nice terrain example. And then the lower right, you're also seeing building footprints from the open data for the city of New York for lower Manhattan, extruded into 3D space and shown in 3D using the same plugin. Obviously, I should mention that QGIS 3 now has a native 3D environment, which is kind of rudimentary at the moment, but is being actively worked on. And I think with 3.2, we're going to see a lot of enhancement for that native 3D environment. So those are some of the kind of the high points for what I think is exciting about QGIS. It's just a snapshot. I think I could go on for a while on that. But I want to cover some of the work that I do as a consultant as well. So this is just a project that I worked on a lot this spring. So I do a lot of work with wildlife habitat, and I've also been working on modeling connectivity for wildlife or identifying wildlife corridors. So in this example, it's for Mexican wolves, and we wanted to identify the areas that a Mexican wolf might use to migrate from one habitat patch to another. And I did this whole analysis using a combination of QGIS 3, Google to process some of the data, R to process some of the data, and then an open source project called Circuitscape that people may not have heard of unless this is your focus area. This is an open source project, and it's built to model connectivity across a landscape for a wildlife species. And it uses electrical theory, so it's really measuring conductance and resistance across the landscape for a species. So the area that I was working in is kind of west central New Mexico and east central Arizona. So Albuquerque would be in the upper right, Flagstaff and Phoenix to the west, Tucson to the south. And so what I did for this analysis was develop a couple layers that would be used to model how a wolf could move across the landscape and where it would encounter resistance and where it would have more conductance, where it'd be easier for it to move and vice versa. So one of the layers I used and weighted was this land use land cover. So this is land use land cover weighted for how a wolf would interact with it. So the blue is most conductance, and the red areas are the most resistance. So you can see the urban areas being in red, and the wildest areas where there's also prey for wolves being blue. This next layer is distance to roads. So this is something I computed in R. And it's, again, wolves are going to be avoiding roads generally. So the blue areas are the roadless areas, and the red areas are the densest roads. So it will show you how a wolf is likely to move across the landscape from the perspective of roads. This layer is terrain ruggedness. So it's built from a digital elevation model. And wolves generally prefer flatter terrain than more rugged terrain because they're pack hunters, and they chase prey to wear them down. And so this looks at conductance across the landscape in terms of ruggedness. So some of the steep canyons being coming out in red, and some of the flatter areas being more easy to move through. So what I did was then combine those into this resistance surface, and this is the weighted 3 layers combined. And then I ran CircuitScape against this. I used these existing wilderness areas as focal areas. So CircuitScape basically measured the conductance between all these green focal areas. And so the blue areas are the areas where you could think of as a wildlife corridor, or just zones where a wolf might use to migrate from one area to another. I also measured the least cost path between all of these. So these dark lines would then be the least cost paths between all the different combinations of focal areas, again shown in blue. So that's a lot of the conservation work that I'm involved with. This last snapshot shows potential wilderness areas in relation to that. So this could be then used as an argument for why some of these areas might be more valuable to protect, because they are going to be providing connectivity for wolves when they need to migrate. So getting back to the teaching side of the ISLE, earlier at the beginning of this, I mentioned that I've been teaching open source GIS since 2008. And after teaching that full semester class for a few semesters, I wrote a little piece for Directions Magazine in 2011 about my experiences teaching GIS at the community college level. So you can look that article up if you're interested. So what I've noticed through my years of teaching is that, first of all, most of my students have learned GIS through an ESRI program. And so what I've seen when they've been through usually a few semesters of GIS using Esri, and then I hit them with the open source world in QGIS, and usually first off they're shocked that they've never heard of it before. But once they start learning how to do a clip and a buffer and other things in QGIS, my sense is that they start understanding the concepts more and focusing on the data and what they're doing to it more than just what button to push to get through a lab exercise. It helps them think a little more critically about what they're doing. I think also, just on the practical side, a lot of them enjoy that they can install QGIS on their Mac and use it. And personally, I feel that it's a little unethical to get students hooked on an expensive proprietary software that they may not be able to afford once they graduate. So I love this tweet by Spatial Punk a couple months ago. My favorite thing about all FOSS software is that a brilliant kid will never be held back because of the price of entry. I think that's really important in democratizing our software and letting everyone have access to it. I also think there's a lot more educational resources out there than there used to be. Things like books and the Geo Academy and other curriculum that have been made available through OzGeo and Geo for All that people can adapt to their needs. So one of the last things I want to talk about here is kind of for me, a blending of both these worlds. This is also a client of mine. I've been working for the National Library of Medicine for the last 6 or 7 years on this project. So I've developed this thing for them, a program called Community Health Maps. And this is an educational project. So we're focused on public health and helping people who are working with underserved populations and minority populations have access to mapping software. And so really the goal here is to empower people. And I go in and I teach a workshop, and I've done this in dozens of places around the United States, where I, in a half a day, show them how to use their smartphones to collect data with Fulcrum, come in and map that in the online website Cardo, and then use QGIS to do some spatial analysis or make a map. And I can usually get people who are not the typical GIS users. These might be public health workers who've always been intimidated by the technology, but I can get them to use these tools within a few hours and start getting excited about the fact that they can now go and collect their own data. And so that's really fun to see that intimidation get shed and the excitement grow. And this kind of brings me to another thing about teaching open source GIS, is that I've also seen, and this is just anecdotal, but students typically will feel that QGIS, for example, is more intuitive than ArcMap after having used both of them. Obviously, everyone's going to have a different opinion on that, but that's what I've seen. So for this Community Health Maps project, like I said, we've been all over the country. We've been to Seattle several times, Honolulu, Charleston, South Carolina, Miami, Florida. So I'll just quickly cover what this looks like. So I'll usually go into one of these places and do a half-day training. We went to the Medical University of South Carolina pretty early on, and I did an initial training with 12 people, again showing them Fulcrum, Cardo, and QGIS and how they can use all of this together. And there was enough excitement from that initial training that the second one had 25 people, the third one had 78. So it's really grown. Had the same experience at the University of Washington, where we had sitting only attendance, sitting room only. A couple students have really run with this and presented some of their work at conferences. Last fall, we did some work in Miami, getting people to go out and measure king tide flooding in their neighborhood. So these are people that are being impacted by climate change and king tides on a daily basis. And we had them measure water quality and fecal coliform, and then show the results on a map that evening. So we could see where they collected data, what the flood depths were, what the salinity of the water samples was. And for these community members, this is a really empowering thing that they can now take to the city council in Miami and say, we need some help with this. So with the Community Health Map blog, and I know I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to get through a couple slides here and then we can open it up for questions. I've developed some resources for this, which includes a curriculum. So there's a blog that I moderate where people have case studies they put up there and I can review technology for people. The lab exercises I've developed are a series of 6 that take people on a little deeper dive than what I can do in a 4-hour workshop, so they can go through and build their skills in a self-paced way. And these are all available for download by anyone. I've also developed videos for each one of these lab tasks so that people can watch a couple-minute YouTube video, and it's all closed captioned as well. So it's been a really exciting program. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was where I would like to see QGIS evolve. And I think one area is documentation. This is a known issue, and it's a big job, and it's done mostly on a volunteer basis if people aren't aware of that. But I think it can always be improved, and if this is a way that people can contribute to QGIS without being a C++ programmer. I'd like to see a little better support for raster attribute tables. I've been working on a proposal for that. Better summary table tools. I run into a lot of times when I do something in QGIS where a layer that might work in the Esri environment comes up as having invalid geometries on the QGIS side. I think it'd be nice to have some better tools for dealing with that. And lastly, I'd like to see just more schools teaching with QGIS. I think it would be exciting to have people's first introduction to GIS be through QGIS, and then maybe learn Esri later on and see how that goes. So that's kind of my final thought. And I guess we can open it up to questions at this point.
Excellent, Kurt. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Hi, everyone. Can you please use the chat function here in the interface to type your questions? If you, again, roll your mouse to the bottom of the interface, a menu pops up, and you will see a chat balloon there that you can click on and type your question. Well, that comes up, Kurt. Oh, there is one already. So you, if you could just, Kurt, please read the question so it's for the recording, and then answer it.
Yes.
Can you see the question in the chat if you click on the chat balloon?
Yeah, I see. I don't see the question. Let me see.
Oh, well, there was a. Uh-oh. No.
I typed hello, everyone, but I didn't.
Oh, that was you. Okay. No, anyway, okay. Let me ask you a question while we have some other contributions. So in your last slide, if you can please go back to that one. So those are the to-do list for the community, in your opinion, of what will contribute the most to enhance QGIS. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So I just want to emphasize it again there, so that we have it there for the recording for future reference.
Let me get back to that slide while you're.
Yeah, there you are. So that's a to-do list in your opinion, and that's very valuable because you have been working so long and so in depth into this that this is a very very important opinion in terms of what is necessary. Okay, so there's a question already, so I'll let you read them and answer them, please, Kurt.
Okay. I think I'm having trouble sharing my screen and seeing the questions at the same time, so I may need to stop sharing them.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. How is LiDAR supported outside of LAS tool plugins? That's a good question. I think LiDAR support is with native QGIS algorithms is I haven't worked with LiDAR a lot, but I think it may not be in existence at all at the current time. I think LiDAR support is pretty much completely through third-party providers. There's a new one called Whitebox Tools for QGIS 3. There are LiDAR tools in GRASS. There's LAS tools. And there are some basic things you can do with Google and LiDAR, but that is an area that I think they may rely on third-party providers to provide. So I got a question from Dave Murray. Students are interested in learning and then applying their skills with gainful employment. How is the FOSS4G employment market? That's a good question. Personally, I don't always follow the market because I haven't looked for a job in a while, but I do know that locally, a lot of local agencies and state agencies are starting to look more towards open source tools to kind of work in a more hybrid environment. So I know that people are anecdotally looking for people who know PostGIS and QGIS and R and things like that much more commonly than they used to be. From Andrew Stickney, Kurt, have you had students with your previous ArcGIS experience in your classes? How have they managed the transition to QGIS, finding tools, matching concepts, workflows, etc.? I would say, I think every student, with no exception, has had previous ArcGIS experience. And like I said, for the most part, I think they find it more intuitive and things are easier. They, of course, have to learn where the tools are, and there is a learning curve with a new piece of software. But I usually find they find the transition pretty seamless because superficially, QGIS looks a lot like ARC. It has the table of contents, the pan and zoom tools in the same place. So I think there's enough similarities that the transition is pretty easy. How do you deal with the requests for reading DWG files? Oh, yes. So again, this is an area that I don't often have to deal with, but there are some new tools in QGIS 3 for dealing with AutoCAD files. I don't have a lot of personal experience. I can't directly speak to it, but it is an area that QGIS has been working quite a bit on, so I can say that. Habitat connectivity, circuitscape for large unit areas. Any issues with processing? Crashes, long time to process. Yes, so circuitscape does have some limitations. The study area that I had was, I think I calculated as 300 million pixels, which sounds like a lot, but it's not a billion pixels. So it's a relatively small area. And what I find with circuitscape that really limits it is the number of focal areas that you're trying to connect. I had to group focal areas that were close together because my list of focal areas was getting so large that, not to get too far into the weeds, but circuitscape will try to connect every combination of focal pairs that you have. So if I had 100 focal areas, it's 100 squared for a circuitscape to process. And even though only one was taking a couple minutes, it was going to take like 4 days for it to run. So I did run into that and had to deal with that. Let's see. GRASS does some LiDAR-based analysis, right? I was helping a guy at the state DNR the other day in using it. Yes, GRASS does have some LiDAR-based tools. So there are tools in GRASS for dealing with LiDAR, absolutely. PostGIS Postgre can store point clouds. GRASS has some tools, not as robust as LAS tools. So people are posting some experience with LiDAR and LAS tools here. So just pointing out that PostGIS has point cloud tools within it. This person has had issues with well-known text from QGIS into Esri. Esri has its own well-known text. And yeah, I think that's an issue that you run into a lot with Esri, is that they will often have their own spin on a spatial data standard, and it makes interoperability with Esri difficult sometimes. Let's see. Are there published spatial analysis resources? I work and teach raster GIS and would like to have some more comprehensive resources. Yes, so first of all, the QGIS and GRASS documentation have a lot in them online for raster processing. There are also some good books. Looking at my bookshelf, there is several books. One, QGIS Blueprints and QGIS by Example, are both books that have some raster processing in them. And I'm looking for the book right now. I may have to enter this later as it comes to me. But there is definitely, yeah, there's a book on remote sensing and GIS for ecologists that I have, and I'm happy to follow up with the title and citations for these. But suffice to say, there are definitely resources out there, and maybe I need to post a list of those so that people can access that.
In that regard, Kurt, if when you send me your slides, you can add at the end anything that you want to do, like you just mentioned. And so then we post the slides and people will have access to your slides and any extra thing you want to put it there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that.
Thank you. All right. Do we have any other questions or comments at this point? So now, give you about a minute more. We're right on time. Kurt, really appreciate you doing this very insightful presentation. There is nothing like hearing from someone that has been working for a long time and doing the depth of your work within the QGIS community. That's fantastic. I think it's going to be very useful webinar for many people that want to explore and to look into getting more use of QGIS. I believe we have another one. Is that? Oh no, we just have a compliment to you. Great presentation. I completely agree. Very good presentation. So, well, again, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us. Kurt, again, thank you for taking the time to do this great presentation. And we will have the recording posted as soon as possible. Any last thoughts, Kurt, you want to share?
No, but I guess I didn't really talk about PostGIS much, but I think, you know, PostGIS is one of the most powerful things out there. And when you combine PostGIS with QGIS, you have, you know, a complete enterprise system. So I could have and should have spent more time on PostGIS, but I encourage people to look into that as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kurt, again, and thank you everyone, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.